But yeah, let's start this session. This session is about, it's called What's Up in the MyData Community. I'm Silla Sepp. I work as a community lead in the MyData Global. And we have today 5 different really interesting and great initiatives that look into how could also we look at these different issues and from the human-centric perspective and have that approach to personal data. So we have 5 people presenting the initiatives for 5 minutes. As we are so tight with time, I need to be also quite strict with the time, so I will put on the timer for this. So in the end of every presentation, the presenters will hear a bell if the time is not yet up. And then after that, we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions to ask from the presenters before we move further. So we have here, and you see the different presenters. First, we have Paul Olivier talking about coronavirus numbers and inevitable solution MyData. Then we have Stefan talking about the call for action towards systematic, responsible, and sustainable data collaboratives for COVID-19. Then we have Alessandro for MyData Design Chronicles, Velia Sakani for making employee data transparent, designing to enable and empower. And then finally, Matthias and Olivier talking about the initiative called The New Governance. I hope all of the presenters are with us and have found their way here, how to also afterwards share their screen. So first I will give the floor to Paul Olivier and I will skip sharing my screen so you can also take over.
Okay, so I would like to talk about COVID-19 and why we need a MyData approach. So as we speak, there is, of course, a health and sanitary emergency. And I think the science is coming through and showing some path out of this emergency. And the governments are starting to understand what should be done as a consequence and are adapting the laws in Europe as we speak. So there were different amendments, for instance, today in France. Some of them passed, some of them didn't, on the use of data coming from telecom operators or from geolocalization to help with COVID-19. Also the possibility of putting people forcibly into isolation if they were affected, for instance. A volunteer, an anonymous volunteer from Personal Data.io is currently mapping all of those initiatives around the world to change the laws in relation to COVID-19. So you will see here a list of decisions taken by different governments, obviously with a huge effect on civil liberties. So today I wanted to first concentrate on the science and deduce from that why there is really a need for a MyData solution. The first strategy that might come out of COVID-19 or that might be tried in relation to that disease is to mitigate it, to have everyone eventually, or most people eventually have it, to acquire herd immunity as a consequence, and to be able to protect more people who are more likely to be affected more severely by managing how many people go to emergency hospitals, need really deep medicine to save them. So there was a report from Imperial College trying to model all the different ways this could be done and all the different ways we might, oops.
The screen is
Olivia, unfortunately, we don't see you as changing the slides. So maybe you can just skip the presentation mode and show the slides from there. Maybe it works better this way.
So is it better now?
Yes, now I can see.
Medications.
So I think this has been discussed extensively, and maybe it's not worth delving too much into it. It's basically not going to work. Too many people will die. So the strategy is switching, and now the governments are switching to a different strategy, which I really want to explain because this is core of why MyData is the solution. Recent evidence from Oxford has shown that they've been trying to model based on the best data that we have from China and from Asia in general, which might not be all that relevant to Europe. We don't really know. They've been trying to model how the disease is being transferred. And these 4 colors there, this is to the best we know. The dark blue is symptomatic carriers who are transmitting the infection. The dark green is asymptomatic carriers transferring the infection. The light green is environmental factors, so touching surfaces, for instance. And the light blue is pre-symptomatic transfer. And they're trying to assess the contribution from each of them over time after the infection. The total area under the curve there is 2.0 in this graph. And this is the reproduction factor of the infection. How many people on average is an individual who is expected to infect, right? If that number is above 2, or is above 1, sorry, then the growth is exponential and you have an epidemic. The goal is to intervene in such a way that we can reduce R to less than 1. If you look at the numbers, the pre-symptomatic and the symptomatic carriers numbers are huge. The only viable strategy to reduce the overall area under the curve seems to be to kind of try finding back in time who has been potentially infected and to test those people extensively. So to use the symptomatic carriers, those who start coughing essentially, to encourage them to do testing, and if they do testing and they test positive, to find back all the contacts they had in the past to try to figure out who might be a carrier from them. And to reduce basically the R from 2, as is modeled right now, or maybe a bit more, to R less than 1. Now, could this work? How could this work? Well, this is what's needed. It's in this graph. So the percentage of success in isolating cases versus the percentage of success in quarantining contacts. So it's basically how viral do we need the countermeasure, quarantine, to be? How successfully viral do we need it to be, right? So if you look at on the left, if we manage to have 20% success in isolating cases, and we manage to quarantine out of that around 75%, but there is, of course, error margins, so between 55 and 85% of contacts, then it seems like we could reduce the R factor to below 1. How are we going to do that? Well, the idea would be to do it through an app. This is the idea of these Oxford academics and of a few other people. If someone is asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, and is spreading the disease on day 1, has an everyday life, then through an app, all their contacts are being traced, so that the next day when they have a fever, they can report that they have the symptoms. A test is sent to them, they test positive, and then their contacts are affected. Obviously, this would have an enormous impact on privacy. A lot of governments are trying to aggregate a ton of data from many different sources. So there is an enormous need for a solution that can be data-driven, but at the same time respect our civil liberties. And we know that MyData can be a solution for that. So if you understood this, or even if you didn't, I think you should join us on the mydata.org Slack on the channel Corona Data, because we're working on this, and there is going to be a prototype. There's already a prototype ready, but tomorrow it will be shared a bit more widely. So thank you, and sorry for being over time.
No worries. Thank you, Paul.
I think we can agree it is extremely important.
Yeah. I don't see any questions at this stage in chat, but is there anything that you would like to ask from Paul Olivier or comment on something that was mentioned? You can also raise your hand and voice out your question. You don't need to type it in. Rupert, yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is Rupert Melsom of DigiMe. This idea that also the guys at Oxford came up with, we had about 2 weeks ago internally. We obviously have a bit of a challenge that if we put something forward as DigiMe, even if we put it forward to governments and health ministries, we're putting our own proposal forward, which never really looks so good. How can we reach out to these kind of organizations other than through our normal channels from a more industry-wide perspective, so more from a MyData perspective? And to put it into context, there was an EU bid yesterday that actually has now been extended. We did actually submit to that as well, because the ecosystem that we have, that we can do the data sharing and private sharing, so the edge processing, does actually lean perfectly well for this environment. We can keep the personal data private, and we can also track back through geolocation who's got what, or who had what cross contaminations. But it's bad for us, obviously, to be promoting our own thing.
Right. So I think a lot of people have had, a lot of technical implementers have had this idea. What's new is that the science shows that this is feasible. And so governments are starting to get behind this, which a lot of people would have rejected before. But I think what needs to happen now is development of standards, so that all of those different solutions can rally behind the standard to make it happen very quickly across Europe. And so this data sharing is interoperable, because as I just said, it has to do with contact tracing. So if someone uses the DigiMe solution, if someone else uses the Miko solution, how do we make it work together? So we need to very quickly have standards emerge there. But you should join the Slack.
Okay, thank you.
Definitely, everybody who is interested in the topic, please do join Slack and the channel called Corona Data. I put the link also into the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any other comments or questions at this stage right now. So we'll copy them over also, or you can copy themselves to the channel right away, and these can be the start of a new discussion after this meeting. Thank you, Paul. So I'll ask Paul to stop your screen sharing and invite Stefan Rahul on the floor, so to say, and so with a presentation called Call for Action Towards Systematic, Responsible and Sustainable Data Collaboratives for COVID-19. And I already see the screen sharing, so welcome.
Thank you so much. And I had to figure out how to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And so my name is Stefan Rahul. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, which is an action research center. We are based here in New York, and we are part of the engineering school of New York University. And the mission of GovLab, for those who don't know GovLab, is to improve the way we make decisions, making them more legitimate, but also more effective by leveraging new science and new technology. And specifically, we focus on what we believe are two important assets. On the one hand, people. So we do a lot of work around collective intelligence, citizen science, crowdsourcing, and so on. And the other asset that we look into is data. And so I'm delighted to be able to speak to MyData, because it's obviously where people and data are coming together. And for the last few years, we've done a lot of work on basically a basic challenge, which is, on the one hand, there is a very distributed demand for data, and on the other hand, there's a very distributed supply for data. And so, as we can see in the current COVID-19 situation, unfortunately, the demand and supply is not that often matched in a manner that is systematic and that can also be responsible. And so what we have tried to figure out the last few years is, how can we do this by establishing new kinds of partnerships between, on the one hand, data holders, and that could be corporations, it could also be other governments, civil society, but also individuals, of course, and the demand side that needs data and especially insight in order to improve the way they go about decisions. And of course, this challenge of, on the one hand, a distributed demand and a distributed supply is now fully visible in the context of COVID, where on the one hand, many need access to data to answer a whole range of questions. And those questions are not only syndromic surveillance types of questions, they're also questions with regard to, for instance, second-order impacts of actually the interventions that are being developed. What is the impact of remote schools on children's well-being? What is the impact of closing down certain kinds of small businesses on the economy at large, and so on? And so all those questions need access to a whole variety of data. And what we see is that while we have a variety of initiatives emerging, and we have documented, and I will share at the end where you can find our current repository of examples, and I would love to add the MyData examples here as well. But what we see over and over again is that many of those initiatives, unfortunately, are not systematic, i.e. there is no, anyway, most of those things happen by accident, happen to know someone that knows someone that knows someone that can perhaps provide for data. So there is no methodology, let alone a system in place. It's quite often not sustainable, meaning most of those things that we see right now are volunteering efforts, which is similar that we see before. And so how can you sustain this, especially given the fact that this is going to be a longish probably effort, but also how do we sustain that kind of infrastructure for the next crisis? Because unfortunately, the frustration that we have is that we've been there before. The last crisis that we tried to deal with was Ebola. And so we had the same problems that we have now. So how do we become more sustainable and systematic? But then lastly, of course, how do we do this in a responsible manner without undermining the civil liberties that ultimately enables, of course, a whole range of activities that we keep dear, but also without actually providing harm to the beneficiaries that one has in mind. And so towards that end, and mainly out of frustration, we developed this, or shared over the weekend, a call for action. And the call for action lists 7, what we believe, foundational elements that need to happen in order to become more systematic, sustainable, and responsible over time, so that we don't have to look back and with the next pandemic or within a few months and say, we still have not figured out how to do this in a more, by building a more infrastructure for the future, including engaging citizens. And so those 7 actions are, none of them are new. They are quite often, they are based upon also some of the work that I've done in the context of the expert group to the European Commission on business to government data sharing. And they range from developing a governance framework, which also quite often means clarifying the framework. And it was already pointed by Paul, is that it's kind of confusing at the moment. What is the governance structure that applies to engaging people? And that also involves co-designing. We believe that co-designing with people is essential to get this right. We need rapid and responsible experimentation. And I'm going to end here because I see someone gets nervous there, that if anyone is interested, please go to datastewards.net, where you will find the call for action featured on the top. We hope that you might sign the call. At the moment, we have 200 key actors that already have signed the call, so that it becomes a movement, because that's really what we need to go beyond those ad hoc initiatives. We also have a repository of examples and current projects, so you can submit your project there as well. And of course, you can share widely, and also contact me if you have any suggestions to then take on any of those 7 areas that we have called for, because obviously we need to move them from a call to action. And that's what we hope this community might also be interested in joining. Thank you so much. And again, apologies for going over time. I'm getting used to remote presentation.
Thank you, Stefan. So giving the floor to the audience, are there any questions to Stefan? Would you like to comment on something that Stefan shared? Please either write your question into the chat or voice it out directly.
John here, Stefan. Thanks very much for that. That was terrific. So the term data stewards, I run into that in enterprise data management a lot. That's often code for patting an individual on the head and say, trust us and we'll take away the data. So how do you envision responsible data stewardship where there's a fiduciary duty to the individual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And actually 3 weeks ago, we released a report that I can share in the chat once I can figure out to get back to chat. where we have called for a redefinition and a broadening of the concept of data stewardship. Again, we still use the term data stewards because we believe it still captures what we actually want to achieve. And I totally agree with you, is that so far data stewardship has been really interpreted in a very narrow sense, focusing on data management and quite often focusing on security of the data. And so we believe that we need to really establish a new profession of data stewards that also have a more responsible and accountable approach to those that actually have shared the data and that is under their stewardship, in order to make sure that the data is of course, not used for purposes that might harm them or that are inappropriate or let alone illegal, but also that can be shared back in a manner that is that creates additional kinds of value as opposed to purely extracting of value. And I can share that paper, and what we are hoping to do is actually build and make corporations and any data holders responsible to establish that data stewardship function that goes beyond a chief privacy officer as well, or goes beyond a chief data officer, which mainly is focusing on internal KPIs.
Thank you, Stefan. I see several links being shared in the chat, as well as continuous questions. How can, for example, MyData hubs help responsible data stewards emerge in their own area? So I will welcome you back to the chat, so we can also perhaps continue there while we move on with the next presenter. So next up we have Alessandro Cavelli from Entity Data, and he will have a presentation called MyData Design Chronicles. So Alessandro, please.
Okay, so hello everyone, very excited to be here, and the topic will be a little bit different for this presentation. So first of all, again, I'm Alessandro Cavelli, and I'm a UX and service designer, and I work for Digital Entity, which is a company owned by Entity Data. And along with Markun Nosainen, we are among the initiator of the MyData design that has been set up during the last conference in Helsinki. And I would like to start this presentation showing you this kind of representation of a design process. I really like this representation because it's very different than the usual representation of a process of designing, which is usually very linear. Design is not linear at all. There are many twists and back and forth during any design process, although cannot be really said clearly. Then I just want to show you a little bit how it looks like being within this process. For instance, I took this picture during my last visit in Tokyo. Perhaps you can see a few of also my data faces there. And what you can see from, so there are a few very visible elements of our design process that came up through this picture. For instance, there is of course a design team, although in this case is just me, but my team was in Milan, of course. Then there is a tech partner. We usually work with tech partners. And then there are many different stakeholders being involved in the design process. Stakeholders that collaborate with each other. Sometimes they fight with each other, and perhaps they might also have different interest and understanding and vision of the design process, what should come out of this process. There are also a few things that are potentially less visible, and I want to point this out to you. The first one, these things are the elements of a good design process, which is of course the design knowledge that should reside on a design team, and very important things of any good design team is to choose the right tools and methodologies for addressing the design process. So for instance, this attached on the wall is a tool which is a design tool which is called service blueprint, which is that tells a story of a service that is not quite still there, but in designing, drawing this blueprint, this idea, this storytelling of the story, everyone who doesn't have a design background can contribute, can collaborate. And basically, yes, these are the three elements that are actually allowed to manage the complexity of any design process and coming up with a new product, service at the end of this process. And of course, why this matter to MyData. And perhaps this is not, I don't know whether this is the right picture to show, but this was the last meeting that I attended, community meeting I attended in Edinburgh. And what I can see here is that this is also a design process where there are core values and ideas that are shared and with stakeholders and design and community members around the world. Of course, the scale is very different than the picture I showed you previously. But again, these tools, these skills, design knowledge, design methodology, and tools are still very valid, very useful for coming up with very different outputs. This can be MyData operator, service, new service based on MyData, data governance, data-driven cities, and many of these will be also addressed in the next conference in Berlin, I think, and we will try to help this out. And so yes, so since these are very useful elements of the design, could be very useful in MyData, and what we think is that we need a design community, which is for helping. Sorry, I'm too late. No, 20 seconds more. So, and this design community could be very helpful for helping to make MyData core principle pragmatics and easy to use and understandable by everyone. Be turned, for instance, in tools that everyone can use in the design process, merging perspective and fitting the MyData into people's everyday life, which is what we usually do. And of course, creating more services based on MyData. So, okay, so I just done, and my apologies for taking too much. These are the main takeaways I want to read through. So please just join the MyData design channel, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alessandro, for this presentation and taking care of also the time at the same time. We'll post the call to actions definitely to the chat as well. I'll give links to the concrete channels right away. So what are your questions and comments to what Alessandro shared?
Yeah, can I just generally comment that just talking with people and organizations about MyData in general, I think that's like one of the most asked questions right now, is that you talk about the business, legal, tech, society, and then people talk about the user experience as a whole. So just want to emphasize that the design channel, regardless of the methodologies and such, which are great as well, but I mean, just the idea that we have a thematic group, I think it's very timely and excellent that you're doing it, Alessandro and everybody else. Really, really needed for the MyData to happen.
Thank you very much.
Yes, definitely. All right, thank you, Alessandro. And let's move on to our next presentation. She is Valia Sakani, and she will present making employee data transparent, designing to enable and empower. And I see myself on the screen.
Yeah, just a sec. I'm setting it up. Now do you see the screen?
Yes.
All right, great.
All right.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Valia. I'm a business designer at Futurist here in Helsinki. And I'm actually working on a project around developing a MyData service internally that focuses on making employee data super transparent in a way that it can, enable and empower the organization and the individuals. And mainly, I mean, it's no big, everyone knows that companies already collect and process data of customers, and now customers are already kind of able to, port that data or take it to other services to gather insights about themselves. often like big tech giants, they do it in questionable manners and it's not very transparent sometimes. So as organizations, here's a really good chance to step in and be transparent about your own data internally, because employee data is vast and it's huge. Like even within your daily workflows, you generate so much data that it can bring like huge insights into individual and organizational level aspects. And Futurist is like focused on creating new things, innovating, and being resilient. And one of the things that got us excited was to develop the, like applications around employee data. And, you know, we kind of dove in tech first. And this also helped us understand how we should actually approach developing applications that use employee data in a better light. But yeah, let me just share some of these examples with you. So currently we have 2 internal applications that we've made that are based on employee data. One of them is called Bubble Burster, which is like an internal search engine, which can help you find people who might be relevant or for you, and you might need help with the topic. So you can search based on skills and such and find other people in the company that are relevant. And then we also have another tool called Lunch Relay, which is a tool to match you with people you have not interacted with in the company before for lunch. I mean, these are just 2 examples of how employee data might be used, but they really their development kind of unearthed these other issues that come up with it, that everyone's understanding of employee data is so different. And some people are super willing to share everything that they have within the company for applications like these. Some other people are just very not willing to do that. And then there's also people who just don't even understand it and don't see the value in services like this that comes from their data that they consider really, really personal or private. But that's why it's important, because like I'm kind of developing this MyData service now to kind of make sure that the employee data that is kind of there and is collected is super visible and transparent to the people who are working in the company, and they can see what that data, what each data source can do for them, and actually choose where in which applications they might allow for that data to be used. And like I'm a designer, so I'm using a lot of like user research and like trying to understand what people think about such a service and how it should be developed. And you know, like a lot of the insight has been that value for employees is very personal. Depending on their role, on their career, it might be different. So any sort of thing that's designed has to be customized, and the insights that their own data might give them have to be able to be customized in a way that it adds value to their work. Also, there's such a variation in how employees view their own data or understand or are aware of what data sources there are, what is even considered data, and that like understanding needs to improve through this MyData service. And additionally, like you can give people control to opt in and opt out, and you know, you can have that in place, but those become very, very redundant if you know their impact is like unknown. Like people don't know the value of them. Like for an organization, using employee data is important because maybe you can see knowledge flow between individuals, you can see social capital of individuals or the network that people form individually, or know what skills are where, you know. So there's just a lot that needs to be taken into account in developing such a thing. And like the previous thing mentioned, like the user experience and interface, it needs to be so easy and understandable that people can see the true value of what their data might bring them, like potentially how it can add value to their work, and it improves their workflow in some way, because data is not it's not easy for everyone to understand. And you know, this is where I don't think there's enough out there. This is something that we need to kind of develop and create, and maybe create a standard or patterns or guidelines of some sort. But if you have any ideas, thoughts on this, it would be really, really useful and helpful to kind of spar, and that's essentially my call of action for that. But yeah, pretty much that's about it. Any thoughts, any ideas? Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Walia. You're the fastest preacher today. What questions or comments do you have to Walia? Teemu, raise your hand.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for pitching, and thanks for coming on a short notice. We had a discussion a few days ago, and I kind of got excited by what you're doing. I think one thing you did not mention here, but you mentioned when we talked, was the transparency, so that when people search for others, the kind of transparency of the searches, and that's the kind of MyData principles. And you mentioned that you also had some discussions within Futurists when you were able to search other employees. So can you tell a little bit about, first of all, that kind of transparency log, and a little bit about the discussions that you had internally?
Yeah, I mean, in general, like the application that we built, like we went an application first rather than understanding what is the level of awareness. So here is just transparency in the sense that if you search for things using this application, you can see, everyone can see what people search for, so that, you know, everything's open, what people are looking for, that's all, like, you know, what is important for them. And then a lot of the searches and how we find relevant people, that's based on, you can see what it's based on, where it's coming from, you know, like various aspects of employee data can be from different sources, but you can see the breakdown of actually what data sources are showing you this result, essentially. But yeah, I mean, we want to kind of flip it over and make it so that, you know, there's a MyData service that you can, every employee can go to and see, okay, here are all of my data sources, and we want to feed it. You can choose to feed it into an application like Bubble Burster or some other application that we built internally for other purposes. But I can see what the impact it would have on that application if I plug my data in, for example. That's kind of what I'm focusing on now. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Walia. Yeah, unfortunately, I need to be strict with time and move on at this stage. But there's comments in the chat asking your views. Do you know some projects in Finland? So I'll invite you to respond to Mika there in the chat. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So moving on to our final presentation from Matthias de Bievre and Olivier Dion about their initiative called A New Governance. Please, Olivier and Matthias, whoever wishes to share your screen for you.
So hello everybody. Thank you very much. So what we should have called this call is 1 billion euros for MyData. Because this sounds good, right? So the idea is to connect, and it connects to the European Commission's data strategy that you all know about, that announced €1 billion investment for a data circulation infrastructure, mentioning MyData, mentioning data portability, and also needing a governance for this infrastructure standards and tools and data spaces. And a new governance initiative aims to unite the MyData community, data operators, but also organizations that want to share data in the MyData way, and in order to build that. And we believe the MyData community has a huge part to play in this, but that we need to now unite and start the concrete standardization work. And I was very happy and interested by the design discussion by Alessandro, because it's not only technical standards, but it's also design standards and legal standards and business standards that we need. And that's what we've been starting to do for more than a year now, thanks to the great help of MyData and inside MyData. And I let Olivier describe the process a bit more in detail.
Yes, hello everyone. So basically, the kind of governance we would like to build is a top-down, bottom-up approach where we federate all the players of the ecosystem. And it's basically what is described in the data strategy paper. The only particular aspect of it is that we are all experts of the MyData architecture, so we implement the MyData architecture in it. So top-down is taking regulation like GDPR and translating into, like Matthias said, technical standard, design standard, and so on. And bottom-up is working on concrete projects. So we already started to unite stakeholders around education and a platform for the education. We are doing the same right now on the mobility domain. And of course, we would like to extend what we do with health, finance, and other sectors. So that's the idea. It's very close to what we've seen in the paper. And right now we have to be more concrete. And yesterday we had the MyData operator meetup for the future MyData operator paper. It's exactly this kind of work. It's grouping together, being stronger together to propose something consistent and not to diverge too much. There is a risk that we get market traction, but we don't work together, and then we build new silos. This is what we want to avoid.
And for instance, on the skills space, we've already united more than 20 actors from 6 different European countries, operators, but also data sources, data using services, and to start this concrete work. And for anybody who's interested, we have at 4:30, I mean in 45 minutes, a 1-hour workshop on this online, and we're happy to answer any questions now as well.
All right. Again, very fast presentation. Thank you for that. So we have also more time for comments and questions to Matthias and Oliver. What are your questions? You can either raise your hand or write into the chat so I can read it out. And yeah, Vivi and Carolina are posting also that the session about the workshop on a new governance will take place in the same meeting room at 4:30. So you can also workshop on a new governance already. Get hands on. Any comments, any questions to Matthias or Oliver at this point? If not, then thank you, Oliver and Matthias. And we're done with our 5 pitches. Thank you so much for all of all presenters. I will share my screen for a quick slide for call to actions. So please join all the interesting Slack channels about Corona data, new governance, design. If you're not yet in MyData Slack, you can get access via mydata.org/Slack. Please do also join the workshop around a new governance later today. And tomorrow there will be 2 workshops around how to design the ultimate MyData app and disinformation and trust in the pandemic workshop. So there are more opportunities also for you to come together and talk about workshop around different ideas, questions that might have come to you during this day already. So please also use this opportunity to connect and invite others along as well to think together. You'll find the sheet to schedule your session in here. We'll add this again to the chat as well. So with that, we have now break time.